Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, forgive me for stepping on your momentum, but here's the one question I keep hearing back home in Louisiana. What's the price tag on the Green New Deal? Senator John Kennedy didn't raise his voice, didn't sneer, didn't grandstand. He just slid that question into the room like a paper cut that suddenly makes you aware you've been bleeding. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was mid-flight, building toward the soaring moral pitch her team had polished for national television, and the interruption landed right in the middle of the crescendo. For 20 minutes, she'd been painting the climate crisis in bold colors: future generations, communities on the front lines, the urgency of action, while friendly faces nodded along, as if the vote were already tallied. Then Kennedy asked about money, and the hearing room went quiet. In that specific way, it gets quiet when a simple question threatens to derail a very complicated performance. You could see the irritation flash across her face before she caught it. The split-second look that says, "We weren't supposed to be doing this part today." She tried to answer with values first, because values are where she's strongest and where her supporters want her living: moral obligation, existential stakes, national purpose. Kennedy let her finish, then repeated the question with the same gentle persistence, the tone of a man asking the waiter politely for the check. He described himself as a budget guy, the kind of senator whose job is to look at the numbers, and he asked again what the plan costs. And you could feel the room shift from cheering a vision to measuring a proposal, from applause energy to accountant energy. The trap, if you want to call it that, was that cost is a two-way door. If she threw out a number, she'd be pinned to it, and every headline for the next month would be that number, not her moral framing. If she refused a number, she'd look like she hadn't done the homework, and nothing kills a big idea faster than the impression it's still on a napkin. Kennedy didn't need to accuse her of anything. He only needed to make the absence of a figure feel louder than any speech. In politics, silence is sometimes the loudest statistic. AOC tried to reframe by saying legislation doesn't work like a shopping receipt, that proposals set goals and details come later. Kennedy didn't argue philosophy. He argued common sense, and common sense is a ruthless opponent because it doesn't care how many followers you have. He essentially asked, with a straight face, how you can ask taxpayers to buy a product without telling them the price. It was the kind of question that sounds almost naive, until you realize how hard it is to answer cleanly on live television. Some senators make arguments. Kennedy makes you explain yourself. Then he pulled out a study. He cited the American Action Forum, and he put a massive figure on the table, tens of trillions over a decade. He didn't insist the number was gospel. He positioned it as a reference point and asked whether it was in the neighborhood. AOC pushed back, calling the analysis biased, the kind of estimate designed to scare people, which is a fair argument in the abstract. But Kennedy's follow-up was brutal in its simplicity. If that number is wrong, what's the right number? You don't have to love the American Action Forum to understand that "I reject your math" works better when you can show your own. Kennedy played the role of the polite curiosity machine, and anyone who has watched him for 5 minutes knows that's not an accident. He sounds like he wandered in from a courthouse porch, but the resume says Yale Law School and Oxford, and the background says he knows exactly when he's tightening the screws. He asked her for her number, her estimate, her best faith range, anything that would allow the committee to treat the proposal like governance instead of poetry. AOC tried to climb back to the moral high ground, cost of inaction, human suffering, catastrophe, because it's emotionally true that climate damage is expensive. Kennedy agreed about morality, then returned to the receipt again, like a man who won't let you change the subject until you answer the first question. There's a moment in hearings like this where the cameras catch the witness doing math in real time, and it's never flattering. AOC's face moved through that quick internal cycle. Annoyance, calculation, regrouping, then the search for an escape hatch that doesn't look like an escape. Kennedy waited, not impatiently but patiently, which is worse, because impatience gives you something to fight. Patience just gives you a mirror. And in that mirror, the problem wasn't ideology, it was specificity. Kennedy's argument wasn't, "your plan is evil," because that invites a heroic defense. His argument was, "your plan is expensive," because that demands arithmetic, not applause. He walked through the elements people associate with the Green New Deal: retrofitting buildings, transforming energy, reshaping transportation, guaranteeing jobs, and asked what each bucket costs. He said, essentially, if the critics' numbers are inflated, show us where the inflation is. And if you can't, why should the public trust that the project is more than a slogan? AOC tried to dismiss the line of questioning as bad faith, and I get why, because the "how do we pay for it" question has been used as a club against every ambitious social project in modern history. But the flip side is that "how do we pay for it" is also the basic question every serious policymaker eventually has to answer. Kennedy leaned into that duality, presenting himself as the guy who's not trying to be cruel, just trying to be responsible. He brought up the scale of the federal budget, not as a weapon, but as a benchmark, and asked whether it's realistic to multiply government spending at that magnitude. Then he asked the question that turns policy into a corner. If it costs that much, where does the money come from? He floated the usual buckets: taxes, borrowing, monetary policy, and he kept asking AOC to choose one and defend it. If she said taxes, he pressed on whether the middle class gets hit, because huge programs rarely live solely on billionaire money. If she said borrowing, he asked what happens when debt piles up, because interest isn't a political slogan, it's a bill. If she flirted with, "we can invest now and reap savings later," he asked for the timeline, because savings later don't magically pay invoices now. None of these questions were insults. They were the kind of questions that sound boring until you realize they can decide elections. At some point, the exchange began to look less like a climate hearing and more like a competence hearing. Kennedy's whole posture was, "help me understand." And every time AOC tried to float upward into moral rhetoric, he pulled her back down to the math like a tether. You could almost hear her internal comms team screaming, "Don't get stuck in the weeds!" But the committee she was sitting in front of is literally paid to live in the weeds. That's why framework can be a risky word on that stage, because a framework is not a budget, and a budget is what the Senate is built to fight over. AOC was selling a vision. Kennedy was demanding a spreadsheet. Kennedy's next move, as you laid it out, was to widen the frame beyond the Green New Deal and into a broader critique of progressive economics. He started stacking program costs like poker chips, healthcare promises, education promises, debt relief promises, climate promises. He didn't claim those programs are automatically wrong. He implied they become questionable when the totals begin to dwarf the country's capacity. He made it sound like he was doing AOC a favor by adding it up for her, which is a sharp kind of political theater, because it forces the other side to either accept your math or produce their own. And if you can't produce your own, you're stuck arguing tone while the audience hears numbers. AOC tried to pivot to the familiar line about tax cuts, corporate welfare, and how Washington always finds money when it wants to. That argument is emotionally satisfying, and it often lands with voters who feel the system is rigged, because it speaks to a real grievance. But Kennedy used it as a wedge, saying spending and tax policy aren't identical, and asking her to separate letting someone keep money from appropriating new money. You can disagree with his framing, but the political impact comes from forcing that distinction in the open, on camera, with the witness on the spot. If you can't explain the mechanism, the rich got tax breaks turns into an applause line, not an operating plan. Then came the part that always makes hearings go viral. The witness starts sounding annoyed, and the senator starts sounding calm. That mismatch is gasoline for clips because it frames one person as emotional and the other as reasonable, whether that's fair or not. Kennedy leaned into the "I'm just asking" posture, and AOC's frustration, even if justified, made her look like she didn't want to answer. In politics, wanting to answer and being able to answer are different, and Kennedy was trying to make that difference obvious. He wasn't debating climate change, he was debating readiness. Your text also threads in the Amazon HQ2 episode, the Met Gala moment, and the lifestyle optics. And those are the kinds of side roads politicians love, because they're easier to narrate than policy. Kennedy, as written, didn't present them as criminal. He presented them as contradictions, and contradictions are political gold. He framed the Amazon fight as a test of whether AOC's jobs language matched her actions, and he asked her to reconcile the two without letting her drift into abstract ideology. He framed the Met Gala as symbolism versus sincerity, the kind of question that makes audiences smirk because it feels like a reality check. And the more he kept his tone polite, the more any hint of condescension from AOC looked like fuel for his argument. Now, I'll say this as a commentator. These hypocrisy sequences work because they're not really about hypocrisy. They're about class resentment, trust, and whether voters feel the speaker lives in the same country they do. AOC's brand is built on being a disruptor of elite comfort. So elite settings become an easy backdrop for critics who want to paint her as part of the club. That doesn't prove anything about her motives, but it does change how a casual viewer feels in the moment. And in political media, feelings often arrive faster than facts. Kennedy's real weapon, though, wasn't the lifestyle stuff. It was his insistence that big proposals must survive small questions. What does it cost? How do you pay for it? What happens to inflation if you inject enormous sums into the economy? What happens to hiring if mandates rise faster than margins? Those aren't gotcha questions. They're the questions that determine whether a bill becomes law or becomes a slogan. The more AOC leaned on urgency, the more Kennedy leaned on trade-offs, and that clash is the core of the whole confrontation. Urgency says we don't have time. Trade-offs say we can't pretend resources are infinite. Urgency says the cost of delay is catastrophic. Trade-offs say the cost of overreach can also be catastrophic, just in a different direction. The viral tension comes from watching which framework the audience accepts in real time. As your version continues, Kennedy keeps escalating without ever sounding like he's escalating, which is the trick. He asks about monetary theory in a way that makes it sound like he's tutoring, not attacking. He name-drops the Federal Reserve and mainstream economists not as a flex, but as a way to tell the audience, this isn't my opinion, it's the baseline. He positions AOC's responses as evasions, which is devastating because evasions are hard to clip defensively. And when he tosses in the "you studied economics" angle, he's not arguing policy anymore. He's questioning credibility. AOC, in your telling, tries to pull the conversation back into the emotional and moral lane. People suffering, the planet burning, the need for boldness. That's the lane where she usually wins. But Kennedy's lane is show your work. And show your work is merciless on live television because it turns rhetoric into homework. If you show your work, you look prepared. If you don't, you look like you're selling vibes. Then Kennedy introduces the alternative path, nuclear power, as a way to make her proposal look selective, not scientific. He frames nuclear as the grown-up answer the Green New Deal conveniently ignores, which is a clever move because it forces AOC to defend what isn't in the plan as much as what is. If she embraces nuclear, she annoys parts of her base. If she rejects nuclear, she looks ideological, not pragmatic. If she dodges nuclear, she looks like she can't commit. And that's the point. A well-placed alternative can be a trap without ever sounding like one. By the time Kennedy reaches the feasible or messaging question, the hearing has shifted into its climax. That question is brutal because it forces honesty about something most politicians prefer to keep ambiguous. Is this a blueprint or a banner? If AOC says it's fully feasible as written, critics will mock the scale. If she admits it's more of a framework or messaging resolution, critics will call it performative. Either way, the clip writes itself, and Kennedy's tone, as you wrote it, stays almost sympathetic, which makes the moment feel like a polite demolition. After that, the narrative you provided moves into the post-hearing media cycle. Clips, trending topics, headlines, intra-party discomfort. This is where politics becomes perception management, because the substance of the hearing matters less than what the audience thinks they just watched. If the dominant clip is, "How much does it cost?" paired with no clear answer, you don't need to win a policy argument to win a news cycle. You just need to make voters feel like one side is doing math and the other side is doing slogans. And Kennedy, at least in this story, understood that perfectly. The next-day damage, as you described it, comes from something simple. Democrats who want climate action still don't want to be cornered on price tags that sound unreal to average voters. So they hedge. They talk about principles, goals, ambition, and serious analysis, which is Washington's way of saying, "Please don't make me own that number." AOC's allies try to reframe Kennedy as disrespectful or acting in bad faith, but the clip's power is that he doesn't look disrespectful. He looks like a man asking the questions taxpayers ask at kitchen tables. And the kitchen table vibe is hard to beat. Now, if I'm giving my own read as a commentator, here's the uncomfortable truth. The hearing works as a takedown, even if you agree with AOC's goals. You can believe climate change is real, urgent, and expensive, and still believe that elected officials should be able to explain their biggest proposals in numbers. You can also believe Kennedy is playing politics, because, of course he is, and still believe he's asking what voters want answered. That's why the moment sticks. It isn't purely ideological. It's a collision between moral storytelling and fiscal interrogation. And on camera, the interrogation often wins. The final beat of your story is the long tail, AOC's brand taking a hit outside her core base, the Green New Deal turning into a punchline for opponents, and the wider lesson about governance versus performance. That's a classic political morality play, and it lands because viewers have seen versions of it before. Charismatic figure meets procedural grinder. The grinder doesn't have to be right about everything. The grinder just has to expose weak joints in the other person's argument. In this version, Kennedy finds the weak joint and keeps pressing it until the whole structure creaks. That's not a criminal allegation, not even a personal insult. It's a public test of preparation. And the most viral part of any public test is that the audience doesn't need to be an expert to judge it. They don't have to understand energy grids or labor transitions or macroeconomic models. They just need to understand the basic vibe of a question asked and a question answered. How much does it cost is a question everyone understands. A framework for goals sounds like a dodge to people who pay rent. That's why the moment, in your telling, becomes a referendum not on climate action, but on competence under pressure. So the story begins where it should begin, not with a long throat clearing about values, but with the interruption that changes the room. A senator with a folksy drawl says he's got a simple question. A rising progressive star realizes the simple question is the hardest one. The cameras keep rolling, the panel goes quiet, and suddenly the fight isn't left versus right. It's vision versus math, and the audience is choosing which one they trust. And once the audience starts choosing, that choice hardens fast, because a hearing isn't just a policy forum anymore, it's a sorting machine. If you came in believing Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was the future, you watched for the moments she sounded principled under pressure. If you came in skeptical, you watched for the moment she couldn't put numbers on her own headline promise. John Kennedy understood that dynamic the way a veteran trial lawyer understands a jury. You don't win by yelling, you win by making the other side explain. So he slowed down, stayed polite, and kept returning to the same two hooks like a metronome: the cost and the mechanism. AOC tried to widen the lens again, reminding the room that climate change isn't a line item, it's a reality that shows up in storms, fires, hospital bills, and lost workdays. That argument can be true and still be incomplete. And Kennedy's whole posture was to treat incomplete as the same thing as unacceptable. He didn't deny urgency. He implied urgency isn't an exemption from math. He didn't call her unserious. He treated her like someone serious enough that she should be able to answer. That's why the exchange felt tense without ever sounding ugly, like a door being pushed shut slowly while someone's still trying to squeeze through. Then came the part that always separates political adults from political influencers: the demand for trade-offs. Kennedy started asking not just how much, but what do you give up? Because every big national project competes with other big national projects. If you spend trillions here, what happens there, and who carries the burden when the bills show up? AOC kept trying to stay in the realm of moral clarity, because moral clarity is clean, and trade-offs are messy. Kennedy kept steering it toward mess, because mess is where policy lives. He asked about who pays when the words progressive taxation hit the hard wall of scale. Not because he needed to convince the economists in the room, but because he needed the audience to picture a paycheck and feel the question land. Does this touch only the rich, or does it eventually drift downward like every major revenue hunt in history? AOC didn't want to say middle class, and she didn't want to say we don't know yet. So she tried to talk about justice. Kennedy let her talk, then asked again, and the second time it sounded less like policy and more like avoidance. At that point, the hearing began to look like a chess match, where one side keeps trying to play checkers because checkers is easier to explain. AOC wanted the big picture to stay big because the big picture is her home field. Kennedy wanted the big picture to be forced into small boxes: line items, funding sources, timelines, and unintended consequences. And the camera, by its nature, rewards the small box because the small box makes a clean clip. A vision takes 5 minutes to appreciate, but a number, or the refusal to give one, takes 5 seconds to judge. Kennedy didn't need to prove she was wrong about climate to make her look weak on budgeting. He just needed to make it feel like she was asking the country to sign a blank check. That phrase never had to be said out loud, because the audience can write it for themselves. AOC tried to argue that big historic moments require big spending, like wartime mobilization or the interstate highway system. Kennedy answered that those moments still had budgets, still had oversight, still had a mechanism, and the closer he got to mechanism, the more the air left her rhetorical balloon. It didn't help that Kennedy's tone stayed so calm it bordered on friendly. On a screen, calm reads as control, and control reads as credibility, even when the substance is complicated. AOC's irritation, even if understandable, read as impatience with the question itself, which is deadly when the question is the one voters already ask. Nobody likes being told their concern is beside the point, especially if their concern is, how much will this cost me? Kennedy wasn't arguing with her ideals, he was bonding with the audience's anxiety. And that's a powerful kind of politics. When the conversation drifted into nuclear, it wasn't really about uranium or reactors. It was about whether the plan was a pragmatic solution or a curated identity statement. Kennedy framed nuclear as a practical tool, and by highlighting its absence, he implied the Green New Deal was shaped by politics as much as physics. AOC tried to keep it principle-based, clean energy, community protection, justice, because that's the language her coalition speaks. But Kennedy was speaking to a different coalition, the people who hear justice and quietly ask, okay, but does the grid stay on? And then he asked the question that every ambitious politician fears because it forces an unglamorous truth. Is this a blueprint you're ready to implement, or is it a banner meant to move the conversation? In the real world, plenty of policy documents are banners first, blueprints later, and that's not automatically sinister. But on camera, a banner sounds like a dodge, and a dodge sounds like weakness, and weakness gets clipped. AOC tried to answer in the language of aspiration, bold action, moral duty, transformational change, while Kennedy demanded the language of procurement. That mismatch is why the moment felt like a collision, not a debate. AOC was offering purpose. Kennedy was asking for process, and purpose and process rarely coexist peacefully in a soundbite economy. If you accept AOC's framing, Kennedy looks like he's nitpicking while the house is on fire. If you accept Kennedy's framing, AOC looks like she's selling a dream without a blueprint. Either way, the viewer feels like they've learned something, which is why the clip travels. It doesn't matter whether the viewer learned the truth. It matters that they feel they learned a contrast. After the gavel, the damage, or the victory, depending on your viewpoint, didn't come from what the committee did next. It came from what the internet did next, because the internet doesn't forward nuance. It forwards moments. AOC's best lines were the ones about moral obligation and urgency, but those require context to land. Kennedy's best line was the repeated question, and that needs no context at all. How much does it cost is the kind of sentence that turns into a meme because it sounds like a parent talking to a teenager who just proposed buying a sports car. By evening, the hearing had been reduced to a highlight reel shaped like an indictment of competence. Not a legal indictment, not a moral indictment, just the unforgiving indictment of, can you answer the basic question? Supporters argued she was being trapped into specifics on a broad framework, and there's truth in that complaint. But opponents argued that if you're going to sell a framework as a national transformation, you should know enough to defend it in numbers. And the broader audience, the people who don't live on political Twitter, tended to side with whoever sounded like they were doing math. That's the cruel reality of public persuasion. The person who makes the listener feel safe wins more than the person who makes the listener feel inspired. AOC inspires her base, but Kennedy was speaking to the anxious middle, the people who don't hate climate action but fear economic whiplash. He didn't have to say, I'm protecting you, because his questions implied it. He didn't have to call her reckless, because no number let viewers draw that conclusion on their own. And conclusions people draw themselves are the hardest ones to undo. AOC's team, in this kind of situation, has only a few options, and none of them are perfect. They can call it a gotcha, but that risks sounding like they're allergic to accountability. They can release their own numbers, but numbers can be attacked, and once you publish them, you're married to them. They can pivot to a narrower package. Specific bills, specific spending, specific offsets. But that's less thrilling than a sweeping resolution. Or they can lean into the moral framing even harder and hope the audience chooses purpose over process. Kennedy was betting the audience would choose process, at least for this clip, and the whole setup suggests he liked his odds. So the confrontation doesn't end with a dramatic insult or a viral clapback. It ends with something more damaging to a brand built on certainty, an unresolved pause where a straightforward question sits unanswered. It's not that AOC can't have answers, or that she never will, or that the policy is inherently impossible. It's that, in that moment, under those lights, she didn't deliver the kind of crisp response that makes skeptics relax. And once skeptics don't relax, they start asking the next question and the next one after that. And that's how a single hearing becomes a long-running storyline.